back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I am your host, Sean McKinda.
Konnichiwa, Jackson Kara desu.
And if Jackson is still talking in weeb, that can only mean one thing, and that is Japanese Month Continues, a consolation prize for Jackson, who is not currently in Japan.
I just want to not be in the United States so bad. Is that so much to ask?
So say we all, Jackson. So say we all.
You know, we're trying to flee this Roman-ass empire sinking ship. Like, we need to get out while we can.
But unfortunately, things happening in the world has prevented that from happening. So we're giving Jackson a month full of Japanese media, property, and anime.
We do have some anime. I mean, we talked about a classy anime last week. That's something.
Perfect Blue was a solid, classy film. It didn't make me feel like I wanted to die, unlike another property we'll be talking about next week, which is a good thing. Watch Perfect Blue. Also, watch Sanjuro, which is what we're talking about this week. Because I basically said, Jackson, we need to talk about something that's not just anime this month. Please, let's watch some classic Japanese films. And so we settled on another Kurosawa film, which I am super excited about.
Yes, I'm excited. I'm glad we watched this one too, because I also wanted to do another Kurosawa because I think it's safe to say we were both enormous fans of Seven Samurai.
Seven Samurai is so good.
Yeah, Seven Samurai is god tier. And this isn't as good as Seven Samurai, but it's not really a fair comparison because that was like a sweeping, monumental epic.
It is kind of like comparing the Iliad to Green Eggs and Ham, which is to say that they both do their job very well. They're both entertaining, and I mean, this is not me knocking Green Eggs and Ham. Don't misunderstand me. This is not even me knocking children's media. We're gonna get into that comparison in a bit here, but it is comparing apples to oranges, where Seven Samurai is this long, sweeping epic dealing with a lot of socio-political issues, and Sanjuro is an hour and a half dealing with a couple of socio-political issues very succinctly and not really leaving much room for interpretation or debate, just saying, hey, these are things.
Yeah, I mean, the characters do like literally turn to the camera and talk about themes at some point, which is not, I don't think, necessarily a bad thing, and especially not here, especially because the movie keeps everything so brisk and so light and so fun, and it's just a delight to watch. This would not have been my first choice for another Kurosawa because he has other movies that are more famous. There's The Hidden Fortress, there's Rashomon, there's Yojimbo. But I'm glad that we went with this one because I probably wouldn't have watched it otherwise, and I had a great time with it.
This was kind of a gut instinct pick for me just because I am intimately familiar with the final scene, having watched a couple of video essays around it, and the impact that it has on filmmaking. So when Jackson's like, what should we watch? I was like, Sanjuro, hands down, easy pick, let's go. Not even realizing that apparently, again, it wasn't as popular. I just thought it was a fascinating film, especially the final scene, which I'm not going to spoil, but you are probably familiar with anyway. However, what you might not be familiar with is what Sanjuro is about, which is, it's a samurai movie, which if you have not seen a samurai movie, the closest parallel is going to be a Western movie. In this samurai movie, Sanjuro, the wandering Ronin, comes to find these people who need help saving their fiefdom, their kingdom, their clan. I'm not entirely sure the correct vernacular. I know they refer to it as a clan, but like, I'm bad. I'm stupid. We all know this. We move past it.
Clan is how they localize it, so I'm fine going with clan. I mean, basically, the short version of the plot is there seems to be some corruption and intrigue within a particular like lord's kingdom that a Ronin gets involved with and like tries to right the ship for a bunch of clowns.
That is a far better explanation than what I did. We first recorded this episode. You all don't need to know this, but this is our second attempt because the first one was really bad.
And I think that, honestly, to be fair to us, I think there's a reason for it. I think this movie is kind of hard to talk about for reasons that are not indicative of its quality. In fact, like, I think it's great and definitely worth watching. But it's the kind of movie that's great in a way that maybe makes it difficult to have a big, deep, stinky conversation about.
Green Eggs and Ham is a great foundational book, it's kind of hard to have a big, deep, stinky conversation about.
I mean, the more that you say it, the more that I'm convinced that's a good comparison.
It came out of my mouth and I was like, that was a weird thing to say, but I kind of stuck by my guns and I'm happy I did because I think it is incredibly apt. To be clear, if it's not already abundantly clear, I also very much enjoyed this movie. Kurosawa is a master of his craft and everyone should watch Kurosawa films. That's just a blanket statement and I will be accepting no criticism at this time.
This is also a much lower barrier to entry than Seven Samurai.
Oh my god, yeah. No, this is a fucking blockbuster of a film and it's only an hour and a half. You are not committing your afternoon to it.
Yeah, because not to say that Seven Samurai isn't, because like we keep bringing that movie up in the context of it being 4 hours and feeling more brisk than a lot of hour and a half movies, which is not a criticism I would level at Sanjuro, by the by. But just that raw number of like, especially I think some people, an old movie, a foreign movie, a long movie, it's kind of a hard sell in a lot of ways.
I was going to say long, old, foreign, black and white. Man, that would have turned me off had I not already seen it, honestly.
No, so like I think like this obviously shares a lot of those traits, but like by cutting down the length, you can kind of see the joy of a samurai movie, and like the fact that it is light and funny and brisk, I think really it makes this a good entry point. And I hadn't thought about it that way, but it totally is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this is one that I watched with Sam, my girlfriend, who does not like Westerns. And as we know on the podcast now, we here stan a good Western, which is not something I think either of us were particularly prepared to say coming into this podcast.
Nope.
And even less so, we stand a good samurai movie, which is even further from something I think that either of us were prepared to say coming into this podcast.
I hadn't watched any samurai movies. I might have been more inclined to try them just because I'm such a disgusting fucking weeaboo.
Yeah, oh no, try absolutely. But I mean, like, even knowing what I knew about them being kind of like the predecessor to Westerns, I would have been like, yeah, I'd be curious to watch one, but I probably won't like it, especially because when we started this, I thought I didn't like Westerns. What a fool I was.
No, we were in very similar positions. I said this even in the pre-discussion. I think it's worth reiterating here that speaking of me being a disgusting fucking weeaboo, I'm glad that we've watched, like, real Japanese movies on the show quite a bit now that aren't just fucking anime. Like, I love anime, obviously, but like, I'm glad that we can do our part in like dispelling the notion among weebs that Japan is anime land, because that's a toxic, bad notion.
Because there's some really good Japanese movies in general. I mean, we talked a little bit about this. We might be discussing Houseu in a bit here, which I'm fucking pumped about. I loved Houseu. It's a very weird fucking movie and pretty much the predecessor to Evil Dead. And that's a great fucking movie. So I'm hoping we get a chance to talk about that. But the point that I'm getting at here is that Sam stayed awake and continued to pay attention through the entirety of Sanjuro, which should be a testament to the filmmaking because she is very quick to fall asleep during movies that she is not interested in. So, hey, points to Sanjuro for keeping someone who doesn't like old black and white Westerns at all. Yeah, it's a good movie. I recommend it.
And I think a lot of that, like, special shout out to my man, Toshiro Mifune, the main actor.
Hell yeah, the boy!
The go. Like, honestly, you know, obviously a lot of the Dollars trilogy was stolen from this. Famously, A Fistful of Dollars was stolen from Yojimbo. We talked a little bit about that in the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly episode. And we both enjoyed the Good and Bad, the Bad, and the Ugly. But, like, man, the virgin Clint Eastwood versus the Chad Toshiro Mifune. Like, Toshiro Mifune is so fucking good in this. He's such, like, just a likable, charismatic guy. And, like, he's playing a pretty different character from when we saw him in Seven Samurai, too. Like, Kikuchiyo was the clown in that, with a lot of depth.
A crazy, intense clown with a lot of depth.
Yeah. Like, and the fact that I can remember Kikuchiyo's name at all, like, you know, a year later, is a testament to how strong the character and the actor were in that. So big shout out. Like, yeah, I definitely want to go back and watch Yojimbo, which is this is technically a sequel to, but you don't need to watch Yojimbo beforehand.
I did not realize that when I suggested this film, so whoopsie doodle. But hey, yeah, you don't need to watch Yojimbo, because I still didn't know that after watching Sanjuro. It took Jackson to be like, hey, so do you know this was a sequel? And I'm like, no.
No, I happened to stumble upon it by chance just when I was like Googling like where I could watch the movie and stuff, like in this sequel to Yojimbo. And at first I was like, uh-oh. But it becomes quickly apparent that it's a sequel in that Dollars trilogy kind of way, and that like you have the wandering Ronin who's like just stumbled into another adventure. But like, I mean, I'm sure that like if you did watch Yojimbo and Sanjuro back to back, you could make some comparisons and like maybe plot out some kind of character arc for them. But like that's, you know, for the purposes of this adventure, it's completely self-contained and completely sensible.
So at this point, if you're okay with it, I kind of want to break down my green eggs and ham comparison a bit more, especially as we're talking about why people should watch this film.
Please, by all means.
So in our pre-discussion, I was talking a little bit about how there's almost I hesitate to call it Pixar-like quality to it, but because it isn't a Pixar film, but there is almost a children's movie quality to it. But a lot of people are going to bristle at the term children's movie quality to it just because you're quick to jump to like, oh, well, it's like a G-rated Winnie the Pooh type of thing. No, it's not. I'm talking like a PG-rated film that children could theoretically watch without any, you know, ill consequences, that wears its influences on its sleeve, wears its themes on its sleeves. It's very accessible. It's very readily available to a general audience. And I genuinely think that you could put 10-year-olds might get bored here, but like a 10-year-old with a good attention span in front of this movie, and they'll enjoy it. It's not long. There's a lot going on with it. It's interesting. There might be a little bit of a problem with the subtitles, depending on how well your 10-year-old can read. But I genuinely think that this is a movie that is fairly accessible to pretty much anyone who wants to go seek it out. It's a very green eggs and ham type of movie.
I think that to add credence to what Sean's saying, because I was thinking this sort of independently, not in the context of specifically like children's movies, but even just the dynamic that becomes apparent very early on between Sanjuro and his merry men. I was just thinking the whole time, like, this is Gandalf and like the Hobbit and the dwarves. And that like, I was thinking about the Hobbit in particular because there's like 10 dwarves. You can't remember any of their fucking names. They're introducing like a dog pile. And this is very similar in that like there's the freedom fighter boys, and like you can pick out one or two from the crowd with like more specific traits, but generally they're pretty interchangeable because they're all just supposed to be like the chorus to our like badass Sanjuro and his interactions with the more like interesting characters and individuals fleshed out.
I was counting them towards the end of the film, like just out of curiosity. I'm like, is there always like 9 people in the shot? And like I was kind of counting them, and there was a couple times where I'm like, there's only 8 people here, and I have no idea who is missing. And one time I'm like, there's 8 people here, and then like they all moved, and like somebody stepped out from the shadows. And I'm like, who the fuck was that? Where did they come from? Now there's 9? What is happening? So I mean, they are all entirely interchangeable, but to Jackson's point as well, they're all fucking hilarious, and there is another character that gets added to the mix. Like it's very much slapstick, very almost like Leslie Nielsen Airplane, Naked Gun type comedy, where like it just kind of happens and then you move past it. It's a quick joke that we don't really acknowledge and move on. And it's a funny movie. It's a funny fucking movie.
Yeah, and that's apparent very quickly too. Like from the first scene, they're like talking about political intrigue, and like the movie establishes the dynamic early on really well. Where like Sanjuro's hiding out in this hut where the conspirators are talking about like the daimyo and the lord and the superintendent and the fucking clans and all that shit. And maybe you're thinking this is a more like political samurai movie, and like Sanjuro basically just stands up and is like, "Listen, y'all are the dumbest motherfuckers I've ever met in my entire life, and here's why." Like, that's basically the entire movie. So, like, the fact that they're interchangeable, I mean, much like The Hobbit, I do think, like, The Hobbit, like, I couldn't stop thinking about The Hobbit, and that, like, the fact that there are so many dwarves and you can't keep track of them, that's not a criticism, that's the joke. Like, that's the point, is that, like, these are all functionally the same doofus who, like, collectively make horrible decisions.
Hey, here's a fun fact for you that I just found out today. Did you know that the director's cut of the third Hobbit movie is rated R?
No.
Yeah. Is that not the most batshit thing you've ever heard? That is a children's book. That is a children's book of, like,
that isn't just a children's book. That is a fairy tale.
Yeah, that is the children's book. I like The Hobbit and I don't like Lord of the Rings because it is just a children's book. And it is the only Lord of the Rings movie, even including director's cut, that got an R rating.
Strong Zack Snyder energy, my God.
I was actually watching a video about pretty much Zack Snyder, actually. It was Patrick H. Willems' conversation on why R-rated superhero movies exist, and that is pretty much about Zack Snyder.
I mean, he's kind of the only guy still doing that shit. Like, Nolan made his movies and got out, and that was, like, the closest thing we had otherwise. So,
I mean, it's the DC universe is really what digs into, as well as Logan and Deadpool in its own right. But I mean, Logan's
true, yeah.
Logan's its own beast in a lot of ways. Like, just to have a quick aside about Logan really quick. If you haven't watched Logan, it's fucking great. And part of what I love so much about Logan is how much it tells you right off the bat that it is not a superhero movie and that you shouldn't take your kids to it because it nowhere on it has the words X-Men or superhero or anything. It is Logan in much the same way of, like, Sanjuro. It is nothing more than a title. Don't take your kids to see a Logan like the assholes in my theater who were confused and didn't get it.
I mean, Logan actually might be, like, if you're still not sold on the idea of watching Sanjuro because it's old and subtitled. I mean, Logan is basically a samurai movie. Like, you know, that's a, like, pretty good point of comparison. So if you enjoyed Logan, it's definitely worth seeking out Kurosawa movies.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I do think that there's just such a barrier to entry on, like, hearing it's a Western or it's a samurai film that immediately turns people off, which is why, like, it's a secret Western of Logan got so many people to watch it because, you know, it doesn't feel like a Western, but then you realize that most Westerns don't really feel like Westerns and are actually good, and you should watch them. You idiot Sean from 6 years ago. They're good.
I honestly, like, I think a lot of this, I think that, you know, if we're going on a diatribe about genre, which I think is worth doing, but the thing that could have got me to watch Westerns is that, like, I was a super, super big fan of Breaking Bad and still am. I love Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. That show arguably is, like, the modern version of a Western, but very few people talk about it that way.
Oh, fuck. If you're watching The Mandalorian, go watch Sanjuro.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
That's easy enough. We've solved it. If you're watching The Mandalorian, you can watch Sanjuro, no problem. You're good.
I do think it's interesting, like, how many popular acclaimed things, like, people always say, like, the Western is dead. I mean, I don't think that's true. I think it's just changed. You know, it has genre trappings like The Mandalorian or like Logan, or it's, you know, modernized in something like Breaking Bad or No Country for Old Men. I think the themes and the ideas of the Western are still present in, like, the aesthetic, and so I don't know if we can really say that it's dead when all this really popular shit. I mean, No Country for Old Men was, like, a super mega hit, but it was, you know, like, an Oscar winner at least. But, like, yeah, like, I don't know. Westerns are cool.
That's the theme of this episode, I guess. Westerns are pretty rad, especially when they're samurai movies, because samurai movies, I think, are even cooler than Westerns in some regard, mostly because Westerns took all their ideas from samurai movies, so it's kind of like watching the Dark Mirror episode. Yeah. What the fuck am I saying? What the fuck?
Black Mirror? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm not talking about that at all. Like, I don't want to call it, like, a dark reflection, but, like, a weaker version of it. There's a phrase I'm looking for. There's a turn
Grocery
of phrase.
Store brand?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Let's stop talking about this. this was bad. Is there anything we want to talk about else in the pre-discussion, or do we want to delve into spoilers?
We can delve into spoilers since I know you're really fiending to talk about the ending. So
I am, and I'm also kind of fiending to talk about what's coming up next week, because that'll be a good segue. So, if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. Tell your friends about us. It's the only way we grow. Follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast. You can also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/BADHcast. No idea if that's up and running right now. It should be paused. I don't know what that means for you, our loyal horselings. Go check it out if you want to. Next week, in case you're wondering why I am so happy that we got to talk about Sanjuro before my soul leaves my body, we're talking about JoJo Part 5, which I have started to watch. I'm not ready to talk about JoJo Part 5.
JoJo Part 5, that's going to be more of a discussion than I thought it was going in. Because like it's not really a spoiler since I mentioned this before, but Part 5 is my least favorite part. And I haven't finished rewatching it yet, but even from what I've rewatched already, I'm pretty comfortable holding on to that position. But I thought it was my least favorite part for not really interesting ways. But when you get a neophyte like Sean into the mix, it's easier to like get outside the fandom bubble and really dig into the meat of that. So y'all better come back next week for the fucking JoJo finale.
I spent 45 minutes of our pre-discussion yelling at Jackson about it. I'm so mad.
I mean, I'm a little mad that Part 6 doesn't exist, and I can't even say, like, oh, we just got to get through Part 5 because Part 6 is based. Part 6 doesn't, I mean, I'm not going to, I mean, we could do a manga episode, I guess, but where's that sweet SEO in that? There is none.
So let's talk about Sanjuro, though. So spoilers from this point out, and this actually, they tie into each other surprisingly well. And I'm going to talk about a couple of parallels between them. I'm not going to talk much about Part 5 of JoJo yet. Don't worry about that. But I can talk about the stuff leading up to Part 5 and how it relates to Sanjuro. So let's start by talking about the big final scene of the film, which is where Sanjuro cuts open Kikyu, I believe is his name. I might be...
That's the main villain. The guy he cuts open is the Heavy. I can't remember his name, but he's a separate guy. He's like the main, like Kikyu is like Grand Moff Tarkin. The guy he cuts open is like Darth Vader, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, Kikyu commits harikiri before that.
Yes.
So he can't cut him open. The scene that he cuts open, it doesn't really matter who it is. All you need to know is that he cuts him open and a fuck ton, and I mean that in the scientific term, a fuck ton of blood pours out of this dude's chest. Now, the origins of this scene boil down to a couple of things. One, Kurosawa did not tell anyone on set how much blood was about to pour out of this dude's chest. And two, there was a broken coupling in the hose, which meant that it poured out way faster and way harder than anyone intended. But Kurosawa was like, nah, that fucking rules. Keep it in the movie. And thus, the explosive blood squib was born, something that is in every genre of film and every media since then in some form or another. Tarantino uses it to great effect all over the fucking place. Love him or hate him. I have mixed feelings about Tarantino, and if you've listened to previous episodes, but I can't deny that he knows how to make a big blood whoosh puddle. That's also the scientific term for it, in case anyone's wondering. And it also ties into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, because people get their arms and body parts cut all the time with just gallons of blood pouring out. More blood than humanly possible to have leave your body and then stand back up and be like, no, I can fight. So there's an interesting parallel in that regard.
I think one thing that's interesting, because I was thinking about this in the context as a children's film, and I think you're right, but that would be the one part that I think your average parent
a little challenging for children, yes.
Yeah, but I'm realizing now that That's probably not the case in Japan, or maybe more so now, because I'm thinking about a lot of Japanese media, especially older Japanese media, like that is aimed at kids. Like, you know, JoJo and Dragon Ball are probably aimed at the same audience that Sanjuro is. And, you know, JoJo's much more explicit with the gore, and eventually, I mean, JoJo stopped running in a shonen magazine and moved to a seinen magazine for like older adults. But like even in Dragon Ball, DBZ could get pretty fucking brutal at times. Like, you know, Goku gets like a hole blown in his chest at like the very beginning of the show, and you can like see is like, you know, it's like goopy and like, you know, bloody, and it's pretty gnarly. Characters get fucked up, and that is totally okay in like a children's show, or at least it was. I think standards are stricter. Like, I know that particular hole in Goku's chest has become a problem in like recuts and remakes and reimaginings.
You're gonna say in Goku's life, because I mean, yeah, you got a hole in your chest. That's a pretty big problem, huh?
Well, I meant more for the production staff over at Toei Animation and the people who make the video games, because standards had changed in like that level. It's like something about that scene in particular. Like, even in newer versions of Dragon Ball that retell the story, there tends to be some level of censorship here and there, changing a bit of blood to sweat, or like, you know, removing this or that shot. But that particular shot of like Goku with the hole in his chest is always censored in some way. Like, it goes from being in the original cut, this really gnarly, gooey thing, just like a black void, no matter what the medium.
The JoJo censor, essentially.
100%. Like, that's a more recent development. So in that way, like, Japanese standards have matched American standards in children's media for the worse, I would say. Because, I mean, what made anime such a big boom in the West in the first place was that. Like, you know, there's a lot of...
I mean, it was the big, gross Akira of it all, right?
Yeah, and that was it at like basically all levels. Like, Akira was more explicit, and that like it was shocking to like your average Westerner, like how far a cartoon was willing to go. But even to a lesser extent, like that was Dragon Ball too. Like, that's one of the reasons that DBZ took off here, where the original Dragon Ball didn't, despite attempts to localize it previously, is just how gnarly and violent DBZ could get. I mean, I kind of appreciate that about older Japanese like children's media. It takes for granted that like kids aren't that stupid or fragile, that like they can handle it. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is definitely a reflection of that.
I guess if you are listening to this, there's a little bit of parental guidance at the final scene, but I really also don't think it's going to be... I don't have kids. I should absolutely clarify that. But I also just don't think it's really that bad of a scene, especially because it still looks incredibly fake to a modern audience. Like, it is... The blood is pure black. You can't even tell that it's really blood. And there's not, like, organs or anything with it. It's just blood. And then when he falls into it, it kind of looks like he fell into a puddle of Coke, honestly. Like, there's like little bubbles in it. And I'm like, oh, this is just like, you fell into a dark soda, huh, bud? Sorry, you're going to be a bit stinky, huh?
No, totally. I was laughing a little bit at the bubbles too. Yeah, I mean, unless you're like a super conservative parent, I can't imagine that.
Why are you
like,
listening to this podcast?
Well, I mean, that's fair too. But because overall the movie, and I guess like, you know, we could segue back into talking about like the ebb and flow of the movie. I was surprised because I knew that like, it wasn't like I didn't know about the blood squib, because Sean had brought up, that's why he wanted to talk about this, is that this was the origin, and it was a pivotal moment in cinema for that reason. So like, I expected when, you know, Sanjuro gets into a couple of big fights at points, and I'm like, oh, like maybe we'll get at least a little bit of blood here, even if we don't get that money shot, right? But it's very bloodless, very deliberately so.
There's not a single drop of blood before this point, I don't think. Like, I because I did know this was coming, I was kind of looking out for blood, seeing where it is, and I don't think I saw any of it, even when somebody's like, there is blood on your sword, and there was not blood on his sword.
No, I mean, it's like part of that's probably budget, right? But like the actually, I don't know what the budget of this movie would have been relative, because like Kurosawa would have been pretty successful at that point.
Yeah, I have no idea.
And like this was a sequel to a successful movie, so I don't know. I mean, like whether or not it actually was low budget or like it just feels that way because it's old, who could say? But yeah, like and I think part of it is thematically relevant as well because the movie does have a very pacifistic point of view, which I mean, coming off of Shin Godzilla, I also really appreciated, and it made me more mad at Shin Godzilla.
Go listen to our Shin Godzilla episode for context.
Yeah,
there are thoughts to be had in that episode.
100%. I just want to briefly say that, like, I think that background of because the short version is that I think Shin Godzilla is like militaristic propaganda that sucks, and I think old samurai movies and Kurosawa movies in particular, despite the fact that like he would have been contemporary with World War II, I don't know if he actually served. I imagine he probably did in some capacity because like all men of age probably had to, right? But I don't know if that was like if he was in the shit like the director of Godzilla was. But like, you know, it's funny that you would think like, oh, the guys who literally like fought in World War II, like for the Axis powers, like, you know, you'd think those guys would be like the militaristic ones, except obviously not, because they had to deal with like the trauma and the reality of like the horrors of war and watching your country get burned to the fucking ground and people dying every day and understanding what a nightmare that is. So like they make these, you know, thoughtful, you know, emotionally honest and true movies where Sanjuro is like, you know, paying compliments to I actually really appreciated this about the movie, like how overall like good and respectful Sanjuro is to the women in the movie and like takes their opinions seriously, and considers their ideas about like pacifism and stuff, even if like he does outwardly give them some snark. It's shit like that makes me extra mad at the fact that you have brats like fucking Hideaki Anno who, you know, never had to like see anything outside of the comfort of their little Tokyo apartment saying that, you know, Japan should go like invade fucking China again or whatever. Fuck that.
All right, Grandpa Mid-Ohio guy. This is not to say that I disagree with the fundamentals of your point. I just like how you sound like a fucking World War II veteran out here, even though you've been in Mid-Ohio for like most of your life at this point.
I'm not even 30, and I've lived in like, you know, the middle of Ohio. But I think that gives it even more credence. Even I can see this shit, and I'm a fucking brat.
Well, the other thing I wanted to talk about with Sanjuro in comparison to JoJo, God strike me down where I stand, is, and this is kind of a setup to next week. If you will listen to both of them, I don't know how much of an overlap of an audience will have that will listen to both an episode on Sanjuro and then also JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5. But hey, if you're here and sticking with us for both of those, you're with us for the long haul, and we have a backlog of episodes for you. I'll tell you what, because that is our absolute brand of shit. So the thing that I really like about Sanjuro is that it is this. I keep talking about it like a children's movie, but then keep giving it like these high praises of like an adult film, like The Blood Squib, and what I'm about to say, which is there's a level of cerebralness to it of Sanjuro plotting out basically how everything is going to go. And I think that it works for a younger audience still, just because the dum-dums are a good audience surrogate in a lot of regards, because there were a lot of times that I did identify with them until Sanjuro was like, you're an idiot. Don't listen to them. Think about things for once in your goddamn life. And I went, oh yeah, I probably should. So, meanwhile, Sanjuro's over here, and this is also going to be a comparison that is probably dangerous to make, but I got it stuck in my head and I can't get it out. Because the quickest and easiest comparison would be something akin to chess. But me watching a Japanese film, I immediately made a translation to a Japanese game which is Go, actually. Not even shogi, but Go. Because there's an element of kind of back and forth feinting, of placing your chips in certain spots on the board, and basically hoping to bait your opponent into following that spot, and like basically kind of putting them in odd places and trying to draw your opponent to that location, and basically playing this like 4D chess with each other, or I guess 4D Go in this case. If you're unfamiliar with Go, by the way, it's on a 9x9 grid. I think it might be 48x48 actually. I think 9x9 is like the beginner grid. And you're just placing black and white stones trying to capture each other by building squares around each other. Is the incredibly simplistic way of explaining Go. I am terrible at it, and that is not doing it justice at all. But I think that the movie kind of exudes that energy in a lot of ways of like, okay, I'm going to put my piece here, and if you follow that, you've fallen into my trap, and now I can put two other pieces down, and this piece is then removed from the board, thus making it easier for me to capture other pieces and easier to indeed win, which is really smart and really fun to follow along with. Now, again, I'm not going to talk about JoJo Part 5 because what I'm about to say has a huge caveat with it for Part 5, but the rest of JoJo kind of exudes a similar energy of characters trying to outflank each other in this proverbial Go board of like, okay, if I put this here, I'm going to lose pieces or get stabbed with a knife, I guess, if we're following the JoJo line. But me getting stabbed with a knife or losing this piece actually lets me play this piece, which captures your piece, which is really satisfying in the exact same way as watching Sanjuro. And indeed, in watching Go as someone who doesn't understand Go, because all three of these things, you're basically an outside observer and learning as you're watching it happen, and you feel like you're learning and growing from it. And this is what differentiates it from other movies. Or, oh God, there's a fucking thing that I was just talking about that there was a twist to it that I'm like, it felt like you should have been able to predict it coming, but because you couldn't, it fucking sucked. But these movies structure their whole plot around the idea of watching a game unfurl, and so it doesn't feel like at that final blow when the twist reveals itself and the final piece is played, it doesn't feel like you got cheated out of figuring out how it works, because it feels like you've been watching a master play the game rather than being the master yourself. And that was my explanation of Go, Sanjuro, and JoJo, and I now feel really out of my element, so I'm gonna pitch it back to Jackson.
I mean, honestly, I think that was all apt. And frankly, like, yeah, you did tie it into JoJo, but you did at least couch it in Go, which is like a ancient game that's been played for like hundreds of years. So you know that's more sophisticated and high minded because
Shout outs to Hikaru no Go, an old shonen manga that I read in middle school.
Well, you know, if you didn't admit that part, you still could have come out of this looking culture. But I'm going to make myself look very uncultured because what I was thinking about, and I totally agree with everything that Sean said, and that like I think that that's one of the elements that makes the movie fun is that back and forth between you see the clowns fuck up, and then you have Big Chad, Sanjuro explain why they're dumb. And then, you know, they have the baddies have another meeting, and like, you know, they go over their options and they make their counterplay. The show that I was thinking about that I think is very similar structurally, it was actually Death Note. And it's less over the top than Death Note, but that's very much like it's
also not a hard thing to do. It's less over the top than Death Note. So is fucking Quentin Tarantino.
Okay, all right, that's fair. That's maybe a self-evident statement. But with Death Note, I think a lot of the broad cinematic techniques are very similar, to the point that I wouldn't be surprised if like the director was a Kurosawa fan, and that like there is that like you have in Death Note, it's heightened to be even more dramatic, which is what makes that show such a glorious, fun cheese fest to watch. Where like you have long monologues about the plan, and then you go to the other like, you know, super smart like genius character, and they're explaining their plan and counteracted to the other plan, all according to plan. Keikaku Dori, Keikaku means plan, all those fucking memes. And so yeah, I mean, I Sean explained it, I think, in a more succinct, wrapped in like, you know, real human beings way that they can understand than I just did with fucking Death Note memes. But if you do like those kind of shows, if you do like that kind of shonen anime with that kind of chess-like focus, yeah, you should definitely watch this. It's right up your alley.
I mean, everything that we have said so far is basically us just saying you should watch Sanjuro, because really that's what this episode boils down to. You should watch Sanjuro. It's a good ass movie.
Yeah, and the reason, like, I imagine, I don't know if you have any other major points you want to make, but like I basically spent on those, and the reason that I feel like we're coming up a little short is just because it's a great movie that's great in a way that's like self-evident, where like even Seven Samurai, like, you know, because it's an epic and it's so long and like it tackles many ideas, you can talk about like the small things it does in this and that scene. Like, this movie has its intent, it has its point, it has its focus, it does it all with aplomb because Kurosawa's a master, and you have a great time and then you're done. And, you know, it gets away with turning to the camera. Like, you know, I talked about it. Yeah, it has pacifistic themes, but like those are literally just like turn to the camera, like close up moments. You know, they're not especially sophisticated, but they work. And, you know, you get it. You have a good time. You walk away and you had a great time. And that's Sanjuro. That makes it kind of hard to have like, you know, a 2-hour discussion about.
There is one line presented by the baddies that kind of raises some questions about like socioeconomic, sociopolitical ideologies of the film, which from the line, I can't even necessarily remember what it is, but it definitely was like, oh, capitalism, it sounds bad in some regard. I don't even remember what the line was, which shows that it is something that felt like just an undercurrent that kind of cropped up at one point. And there is a very easy way I could, if I had remembered that line and written it down and dug a little bit further into it, made a more anti-capitalist reading of this movie, because it's definitely there in some regard. But I just... honestly, I wasn't feeling it on this one, because I think that this movie stands on its own enough that delving into an anti-capitalist message of it for the sake of this podcast just didn't feel worth it, as weird as that is. Especially given that every episode we say fuck capitalism.
There'll be another day. There'll be another time.
We can talk about it on JoJo next week, because it's part of the reason why part 5's so bad. Oh, did I give away the ghost? Shit. Oopsie doodles. Wow. What a twist. Sean doesn't like a JoJo.
I mean, it's funny because, like, it's funny that, like, that's the reputation, but you've only had an outright negative reaction to one JoJo part.
I know, and I'm the one who even suggested you watch part 1 way back when.
I mean, we've mentioned this a lot, but, like, when it comes to my horrible, like, weebism, like, you are Batman. Like, you created your villains.
I know, that's the worst part. I have set forth the machinations of my own demise, and I am filled with regret.
I'm not, because I'm about to go have a wonderful adventure in another country. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, no problem. Anything else left to say about Sanjuro?
Nah, it's great.
Great. I'm Sean McKinda. Find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda.
I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller, and also on Twitch at Jackson J. Keller, and YouTube, just Jackson Keller, no J, because branding is a nightmare. I probably should go fucking change that. But I've been doing creative writing seminars, uploading the VODs to YouTube in a more condensed way, and doing them live every Monday at 5:30 on my Twitch channel. So you should follow me for stuff. I'm getting the burps. Let's continue.
You should follow him for stuff. He's got good stuff. You should also follow the podcast at BDH_cast for news, updates, and if I have the energy to put it out, a clip, because I do that sometimes. It just, sometimes I don't have the energy to. Also, support us at Patreon, patreon.com/BADHcast if you can. Again, I have the Patreon paused right now because we don't know what's happening with the podcast. But hey, you can go check it out, and I don't know, maybe you can get access to that stuff. Fucking knows. Also, thanks to those I have with you for the theme song. It is Suicide, alternate take off the album High Octane to Low Expectations. They're a wonderful band. You should go check them out wherever you can. Support their music, stream their music, buy their music, Bandcamp, all that good shit. Also, the thanks to 25 Years Later Site.com. There's a little button of us in the corner that you can absolutely go click on, but you should definitely check out the writing that's going on over there. There's a bunch of really talented people doing a bunch of really talented writing that you should absolutely read, especially in the thralls of Twin Peaks month. It's their bread and butter, and they're very good at it. Next week, the last of the JoJo animes. For now, it's JoJo Part 5. God help us all.
It better be the last of the fucking JoJo parts that we talk about on the show. Because if they animate all of Part 6 and I'm still not in Japan, I'm throwing myself into the sea.
Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go